Leaving up double blue is a telltale sign that someone at the table is going to have a bad day. This type of representation, which could be a video all on of its own, oftentimes changes the actions of other players at the table in major ways. Maybe I don't run out my commander since you clearly have a counterspell. Maybe I just play a few small spells that aren't worth a counter, or maybe play something first to bait it out and then cast my bigger ticket item. It's a psychology baked into nearly every single Magic player after a time. You can be a pro or a complete noob, but everyone is afraid of the double blue. Counterspell's first printing coincides with the first printing for Magic the Gathering, Alpha, and it really is crazy to think that a card printed so long ago is still so prevalent today. Most blue decks will automatically leave open a slot just for Counterspell because it's a reliable and widely available card. The chances a player has a Counterspell in their collection is high. Flusterstorm, maybe not so much. Now, I have a problem with Counterspell, and no, it's not because it's too good. It's actually because we often have better options available to us that go majorly underutilized, and I'd like to make a case for those today. And I want to be clear, my major considerations for replacing Counterspell are specific to Commander. I don't plan on making any outlandish claims for other formats like Standard, Modern, Vintage, or even Canadian Highlander or Canlander.
This game is going to take years off my life. I can already tell this shit's just going to take years off my life.
And because of this, it's important to hammer in that counterspells that we discuss today are measured on the usability and maybe even abusability for Commander specifically. Blue is definitely my favorite color, and I've played with pretty much every counterspell under the sun multiple different times, and now feel that I have enough experience to talk through which options have yielded the best results. I'm going to break down counterspells today into a few specific categories. 1, hard counters. 2, soft counters. 3, modal interaction. 4, non-counter counters. And number 5, these are absolutely broken, get fucked. And I'd like to remind everyone that even with newer sets releasing, you can basically use this video as a template or guide in many ways to reason how or why a certain counterspell may be good for Commander. But with that, let's get on to the very first section.
Wait, you're telling me this just gets countered?
I have so many amazing options in this category. This is the category most similar to the regular counterspell. If you run one of these in this deck, you'll often find either a minimal change or in some cases a strict upgrade to your deck. And I want to start with a card that I actually feel probably the most passionately about, and that's Delay. Delay is 1 colorless and a blue for the card that reads, counter target spell. If the spell is countered this way, exile it with 3 time counters on it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. If it doesn't have suspend, it gains suspend. And as a reminder, that means at the beginning of its owner's upkeep, they remove a time counter, and when the last is removed, they may play it without paying its mana cost. If it's a creature, it has haste. Now, for newer players, this may sound terrible. You're telling me my opponent gets to cast the thing again for free on a later turn? Yeah. Yes, I am. This is precisely the interaction that is so good. See how the counter never uses the word may. The spell must end up in exile, excluding a few obvious cases like a commander getting countered. So if you're fighting a graveyard deck who would directly benefit from having a card end up in the yard with, I don't know, a regular counterspell, you can basically skip over that and it gets countered into exile. And 3 turns may not sound like a lot, but in a game of Commander, 3 upkeeps or 3 turns is an eternity. You often can find countering a key spell into exile, and only getting it back 3 turns later completely seals the deal for you. And this is a great time to talk about the pips. Counterspell is 2 blue pips, and when we have the fewer multicolored producing lands in a 3 to 5 color deck, sometimes we run into a situation where a regular counter actually cannot be cast due to this colored restriction. Having the requirement to only use 1 blue mana is actually a much bigger deal than it may otherwise seem. It comes up all the time in my games where I wouldn't be able to hold up a regular counterspell, but Delay is absolutely at home. Cost reducers can also change the generic mana cost to 0, leaving only 1 blue pip to cast, which is just great. I can't really sing the praises enough for this card, so let's get on to the next. Let's talk about a closer cousin to the counterspell, Disallow. 1 extra generic mana gets you a world of versatility. The main reason that I actually avoided using this style of counter in my decks was because I didn't really understand the difference between activated and triggered abilities, just kind of like the, on the board sort of discomfort, like you don't want to really show that you're a bit of a noob, you know what I mean, to other players at the table. So I shied away from it. But this is is 3 mana, so 1 blue for the effect of counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. Now, this can counter pretty much everything you would need in a game of Commander outside of like channel and some other specifics. But as you continue to play more games, you're going to start to realize that activated and triggered abilities are not just everywhere, but they're extremely powerful effects that often go unanswered because we do not run this type of interaction in Commander. Now, I guarantee you, if you counter someone's Commander ability, they're going to look at you stupefied. This rarely ever happens, and when it does, it's often because you just stopped an opponent from sealing the deal with their powerful onboard effect that they felt was otherwise safe. Now, I think it's also important to point out a few situations where countering an activated or triggered ability may actually go missed, or maybe you just don't know about it. First, you can counter a fetch land with this, as it is ultimately an activated ability. You see that colon on the fetch land I'm putting up on screen now? It allows you to deny a landfall or potentially leave an opponent mana screwed down a land. And there's also a lot of sneaky triggered abilities that sometimes are treated as if they are static. I think a prime example is Sphinx of the Second Sun. So many times I've heard players just announce that they have an extra beginning phase, but guys, this ability uses the stack. It makes it a valid target for something like a disallow. And there are so many more examples of this, and if you want to see a full video on triggered versus activated abilities, let me know down in the comments below. Instead of toiling over every single hard counter that happens to hit activated or triggered abilities, I'm just going to put a bunch on screen right now for you guys that I think are actually really great in a game of Commander. So we're looking at Defabricate, Adric Mathematical Genius, Stifle, Sublime Epiphany, and Tail's End. Notice that Adric is a creature. Even though this is an onboard counter, I still find the value to be absolutely incredible. Tail's End is an absolute classic, one of my all-time favorites. It's never dead. There are more legends printed now than ever, and everyone has access to a commander, which could be countered, and of course it has that bonus utility to counter abilities. The same is true for Sublime Epiphany, offering a world of versatility. We'll talk about this card more in the modal section. I've been extremely high on Defabricate lately. This card is just awesome. There's always a good target for this in my games, and I picked up like 5 copies for 10 cents a piece. You really can't beat it. I think it's also important to point out a subsection of this type of card with Overcharged Amalgam, Sister of Silence, and Tishana's Tidebinder. Now, all of these are a bit different, bringing a body with them to also counter something. In the right creature heavy deck, these are an even better option than a regular counterspell. Not all the time, but situationally they end up being better, and really it's preferential for the person, but let me make a case. Tishana's Tidebinder has the added benefit of being a merfolk, the Amalgam is a zombie, and the Sister is a human, so these even fit well into your tribal strategy, and you may find that it slots in better than a regular counterspell. Just a few weeks ago, I stopped an opponent from winning the game with Tishana's Tidebinder, which I think deserves its own mention because it also silences the countered target for as long as it remains on the battlefield. This is absolutely one of my favorites for this purpose. It effectively removes the countered target from the game. And moreover, Tishana's Tidebinder has actually come up and has gone down in price quite a bit. It's come up in popularity, but gone down in price. I don't know how this happened, probably just more copies flooded the market, but at the time of actually producing this video, I think it's around $5, which sounds like a lot for a single card, but it's really, really good. And you don't even need to run it in a regular merfolk deck. This card is just nuts. So really give Tishana's Tidebinder a look, but if you're in a zombie tribal or maybe a human tribal deck, the other two may also slot in. Before we get too far off topic, let's get right back into more hard counters. I love Dovin. Zvito. I find that whenever I play a blue-white deck, I will pretty much auto-slot this, and sure, it does only hit non-creature spells, but being unable to be countered is actually a huge deal. I've even played this in higher-powered pods to pretty good effect, actually. Typically, the higher-powered groups will say something to the effect of, "Oh my god, you gotta be fucking kidding me," as they look at their hand full of counter magic that actually can't take this off of the stack. And I'll also mention Render Silent in the same area because it also is a blue-white, and it is 3-colored pips, which admittedly is quite a lot, but the effect it gives you on one card is pretty great. We're often fighting for deck space, and when this can counter something and sometimes silence/time walk an opponent, it turns out to be really good. Now, the two we just mentioned require blue and white to be played in your commander deck, but the next can be played in a mono white deck, which always gets me excited. We have other options in white, which will be discussed later on in this video, but as of right now, let's talk about Lapse of Certainty, a card that everybody forgets about. For 2 generic and a white mana, you get the effect to counter target spell. And if that spell is countered this way, put it on top of its owner's library instead of into its owner's graveyard. This is a really interesting card. It more or less completely breaks the color pie, which means that people are very unlikely to expect this card in a casual environment. And I'm going to talk more about this with our next card, but going to the top of the library is actually in many ways a strict upgrade to the direct counterspell, which sends it to the graveyard. This card is 3 mana, which can sometimes be a concern to keep up that much mana for a strict counter, but when you're playing outside the bounds of what your color can normally do, I generally find it a pretty negligible associated cost. And moreover, I would also say that I'm not really defending Lapse of Certainty necessarily as a direct replacement to Counterspell, but if you're in a deck that does not have blue, this can be a very good option. And I feel it's important for me to point that out at least. For many of the same reasons Delay is good, Memory Lapse is just sweet. Again, to a newer player, this may look like we're just giving the opponent something back, but most often, this just completely hoses somebody. Not only does this deny the card from the graveyard, it also means that their next draw is the same thing, and you have a very telegraphed play from that opponent. It effectively eliminates a variable from the game for one turn, and that level of game knowledge can sometimes be the difference between a win and a loss, allowing you to better prepare for your opponent's next turn. This card also often results in table deliberation, for example. So Jim is going to draw Elish Norn next turn. Can somebody else counter that, or can somebody else be prepared to remove it? You can majorly use this style of dictation to your advantage. Use the memory lapse to quote unquote save the table and immediately pivot to ask what the other players are going to do about it next. After all, I'm the one that just answered it. Someone else needs to police the board and that card next. This gives me a pseudo turn of immunity in many cases, allowing me to leverage my good faith with the rest of the table for a win. Now, one of my all-time favorite counters for Commander, albeit not quite as potent as some we've already talked about, is Arcane Denial. 1 colorless and a blue to counter any spell, and at the next upkeep, they draw 2, I draw 1. Now, it solves the colored pip problem, it hits any spell, not just non-creature, and it replaces itself. It's another major advantage of this card because it's often better in these very casual environments because players who just get countered really do get to refuel a bit, and I tend to use this as the power levels drop in my pods. It results in way less of the feel bad moments across the table. At least my opponent sort of gets something and then we can progress with the rest of the game. No hard feelings. But the hidden tech here is the versatility of what to counter. What do I mean by this? You may be presented with a situation where you have Arcane Denial and another spell in your hand that you really don't care about. You can cast the spell you don't care about, hold priority, and counter your own spell. This allows you to draw 3 at your next upkeep, going up by 1 card for your investment into this play. Admittedly, on the low end, 3 mana for draw 1 and filter 2 is pretty bad, but I've done it in desperate situations, and this is one of the only non-modal counterspells that allows you to cantrip the crappy cards that you have stuck in your hand. For that reason, it still keeps a special place in my heart, again, in more casual pods, that is. Before we head on to my final favorite hard counters, I think it's important that we actually point something out. There are well over 300 counterspells that exist just in blue. This wide variety gives us access to plenty of very specific counterspells that fit an archetype. For example, Didn't Say Please is a counter and mill on 1 card. Dismissal Failure is a counter with Hand Hate. Dissolve fits into a Scry theme deck, and the list just continues to go on. The issue that I have with these cards is that often the upside they give is negligible. For example, it's unlikely that the 3 cards you mill from Didn't Say Please will actually matter in a dedicated mill deck. It would be so much better to just run a regular counterspell and a more efficient mill pieces to accomplish your deck goal. The same goes for Dismissal Failure. It's 4 mana for a counter and discard, which may sound good, and it even fits my argument to use counters with this added utility stapled onto them, but this type of utility is so low that not only does it tend to really not matter, it just clogs up your hand as an expensive counter option. You want to be able to deploy threats and hold up counter magic. The extra 1 mana to mill 3 or scry 1 is marginal and can often result in you not having enough mana to actually play out your game and hold up protection. Something like the aforementioned Disallow is strong because it gives you full control over a game state with its flexibility. And to me, that's really worth the extra 1 mana. But if I only get to scry 1 for 1 extra mana, well, I'd rather just not. I have better things to do with my limited resources. Another pair of cards near and dear to my heart are Foil and Forbid. The 2 Fs, might as well make it 3. Both require you to discard something, but with varying degrees of versatility. Foil is great to catch an opponent off guard. It's effectively a free counterspell, only needing to discard an island and 1 more from your hand, which, in my perspective, is oftentimes a small price to pay for free interaction, especially in more casual environments. Forbid, on the other hand, requires you to pay 3 mana with the added option to discard 2 cards to then return it to hand upon resolution. Now, one of these may seem way better than the other when compared this way, but let me make a case for Forbid. This card is great in numerous different situations. If you have a powerful draw engine in your blue deck and you have a bunch of extra cards in hand, you get to abuse the buyback, returning to hand to get some insane value. Or perhaps you're playing a Reanimator deck, which wants key cards into your graveyard, of course. This can get them there quite easily, all while protecting your board state or forwarding your game plan. If you haven't figured it out already, I'm pretty much a value fiend. I play on the basis of how far I can stretch my limited resources. Forbid has been a key include in a variety of decks for me, and even in decks without a dedicated strategy, as long as I have the extra cards and strong draw engine, I'm almost always happy to have this card on standby. Another pair that makes it into many of my Spellslinger or Storm decks are Rewind and Unwind. Rewind is 4 mana to counter a spell, then untap 4 lands. Unwind is 3 mana to counter a non-creature spell, untap 3 lands. Both are really good at what they do. I play them all the time. They certainly won't win you any awards, but being able to untap 3 to 4 lands, especially when some could tap for multiple mana, like a Temple of the False God or maybe one of the bounce lands, is really just great. Again, these are played in decks that care about casting something on an opponent's turn, like Gandalf of the Sacred Fire or maybe Aluge. They also get often used in dedicated Storm decks or have even showed up in decks like Ovika who care about the CMC of the spell, being able to generate 4 goblins for free effectively, protect my board, and then cast another spell before my turn to generate even more goblins. It often turns into a winning situation. I find that Unwind makes it into pretty much any of my decks that want it because the double blue and the 4 CMC cost of Rewind can sometimes just be a bit too heavy, but the versatility to counter any spell can be worth it. Let's hit 3 in a row here. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Negate. It took WotC way too long to print a simple non-creature spell counter, and it's just as good as the day they printed it. Totally fine, valid choice. A spicier non-creature counter is Muddle the Mixture, countering an instant or sorcery, but having the added benefit to transmute for 3 mana. Now, transmute reads, discard this card, search your library for a card with the same mana value of this card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, transmute as a sorcery. This means that the card you find must have a mana value of 2. Muddle is one of those cards that you're pretty much always happy to have early. It gives you board presence and protects key pieces, but if you draw it late, it's never dead. It allows you to go tutor out something to, more appropriately fit the situation. I've even used it in long stalemate style games to sort of thin out my deck a bit when I'm down to 30 or 40 cards, eliminating some of the remaining chaff that I'd rather not draw, which admittedly doesn't happen often, but I really felt like it was just worth mentioning in this circumstance. And of course, Swansong, the de facto non-creature counter for a single blue in Commander. It didn't quite make it into the FU category, but it's really damn good, and in most situations, I'd prefer to run a Swansong over a regular counter. A single mana to counter an instant sorcery or enchantment turns out is just really, really good. On to the final 2 hard counters. Remand is majorly underplayed in my opinion. Counter any spell, but instead it goes back to the opponent's hand and then you draw a card. I suppose I should point out you could remand your own spell to dig further in your deck while preserving whatever it is you just countered, quote unquote, but I've never actually done this myself. It's a little unlike Arcane Denial in that circumstance. The casting cost is one of the major appeals here. Pretty much fits into a variety of decks, all the while replacing itself, which is something that we really should always be looking to do in Commander. If I use a counterspell on something, yeah, I do get the counter, but then I'm down by 1 card to my other opponents. In this situation where you counter a single thing, you and an opponent each expend a card in the circumstance, putting the other 2 players ahead on card advantage. Now, with Remand, it actually goes neutral by replacing itself and then bouncing the thing back to your opponent's hand. And an added benefit is that people get way less salty about getting something returned to hand, which is always nice. But you can always structure your deck with enough wheel effects that it's not going to matter for them anyway, which is unfortunately what I do to my friends. Last and maybe least, arguably, is Desertion. I put this on here just because it's a fun inclusion. 5 mana to counter something, but it replaces an artifact or creature card that would go to the graveyard by returning it to your board. It's fun, but in practice, saving up 5 mana to use on a single counter really isn't guaranteed to actually get the value it promises and turns out to be lackluster. I run it in decks that have a lower power level or I just want to have some fun. It kind of turns people's heads when they realize I stole a key piece away from them, and that really is the beauty of this one.
You don't have as much zip behind this one, do you?
Soft counters are the spells that are, for weak people. If you're a puny, pathetic person, you may benefit from running a few of these in your deck, which, let's be honest, if you made it this far into the video. But seriously, this is the class of counterspell that allows an opponent to pay some type of associated cost in order to get out or mitigate the effects of said counterspell. Let's talk about one of my favorites in order to sort of bridge the gap, because this one is a soft counter, but it can also be a hard counter under the right conditions. Stubborn Denial is a single blue for counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1. But if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, the spell just gets countered instead. This is actually one of the very first counters I ever played, and I ran it in my Niv-Mizzet Perun deck, and I think you can already see why. This counter spell is certainly outclassed in maybe a 60-card format, but in Commander, when you knowingly have access to a 4 or greater powered creature in the command zone, it shines. This oftentimes turns into a strictly better negate for just a single blue mana to counter a non-creature spell. The downside is that on the stack, an opponent could respond to the cast of this, instant speed removing your only 4-powered creature, which would then allow them to pay the 1. Actually, let me double check that real quick. Okay, yeah, so it does work like that. So because there's a self-replacement effect on the card, it is only active when it resolves, so you can remove something. It just felt wrong when I was saying it out loud, but I'm glad I double-checked. Outside of this situation, however, I find that in a deck that both needs protection and has a heavily powered blue commander, this counterspell is really incredibly good. Let's move on to the rest of the category, however. Now, if you can't already tell, I really love breaking the color pie, and counter magic is oftentimes the strongest thing to do in a game of Commander, and when that level of authority comes from a non-blue deck, you likely will catch your enemies off guard. Mana Tithe is 1 white mana for the effect to counter target spell unless its controller pays 1, and I know that this sounds terrible, especially when we look at the other white counters, such as Lapse of Certainty, but there are plenty of situations where your opponent won't be able to pay the 1. Catching your opponent in these moments is always off-putting for them, especially when it comes from a non-blue deck. You caught them with their pants down, so to speak, and the normal awkward staring contest that happens when you look at them in the eyes while they sit on the toilet after you just kick down the stall door doesn't actually have to happen. You just counter their spell. But seriously though, I do like Mana Tithe. It does suffer from being in a 4-player free-for-all format. Often people will just have the 1 mana to prevent the counter, but I find that if it's often deployed at an earlier stage of the game to counter something key like a Soul Ring or Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe when they tap out, it really does feel good because often your opponents will tap out to play these types of cards or they unknowingly play into it. Maybe they don't play their land first, play out their card, and then boom, they're screwed. After all, who plays this card to begin with? Very few people, it turns out. Let's stay in the vein of breaking the color pie. Tybalt's Trickery is 1 red and 1 generic for counter target spell. Choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller mills that many cards, then exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than that spell. They may then cast the card without paying its mana cost. Then they put the exiled cards on the bottom of their library in a random order. Now, I put this in the soft counter section because, well, sometimes this card just backfires, but I find that the times it backfires are few, and this is a result of your good game decisions. The thing that you're countering with Tybalt's Trickery should be one of the scarier threats in your opponent's deck that you wouldn't mind seeing something else coming out. If you often find yourself in the situation where this card is bringing out bigger threats than the one that you just countered, it likely means that you are simply not selecting the correct thing to counter. This is something that takes experience and also game knowledge. Knowing your opponent's deck list would certainly help, and if you have the pleasure to have a routine group, then you certainly know where the problem cards lie. Save this for those spells. Don't throw this thing away on something that isn't absolutely game ending. I'd like to do a few right in a row, sort of rapid fire style, so let's do it. Miscast, counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 3. Mana Leak, counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. Spell Pierce, counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. And Dazzling Denial, counter target spell unless its controller pays 2. If you control a bird, counter that spell instead unless they pay 4. Now, all of these cards are going to be up on screen right now for you to, visually see them. These are all very similar in function. They're low to the ground counter magic that allows the opponent to get out from underneath it at a cost. Now, I really love Miscast, Mana Leak, and Spell Pierce, and can definitely recommend them if you're looking for just less brutal counter magic that still gets the job done. I've had multiple groups of people look at me strange when they realize that the single blue mana Miscast absolutely hoses their big sorcery. Just a few weeks ago, I countered my friend's Breach the Multiverse with this card, and it's just so good. I admittedly haven't used Dazzling Denial to this point, but I always love these specific tribal includes that actually just have a chance to be really good. I hate cards that do nothing without the impact of the tribe, but in this case, you get the counter either way. It's just the associated cost for the opponent that changes. It just makes it better. And just look at the flavor text on this card. Maintaining brilliant plumage isn't just a statement. It's a tactic. I mean, come on. The writers actually did a good job on that one. There are so many good soft counters, but I wanted to leave you with 2 of my favorites. Lose Focus is 1 blue and a generic 4, counter target spell unless its controller pays 2, but the cool thing about this spell is that you can replicate it for a single blue mana. Not just a single blue, you can replicate this counter, any number of times for each blue mana spent, and then choose different targets. This card plays well in groups with more complicated stacks, allowing you the flexibility to selectively dogpile a particular problem spell and forcing your singular opponent to deal with the copies that are now targeting it on the stack. Or you can also spread these out to different spells owned by other players. Very flexible. And I really do love that level of flexibility. Often we're at war with what specific cards to include in our list because we have limited space. But in this circumstance, you have a counter that hits multiple different spells or can effectively overwhelm a single opponent with multiple counters. The other benefit is that this card is only like 10 cents US, which is just dirt cheap. And finally, an oldie but a really good card is Daze. Daze is 1 blue and a generic 4. You may return an island you control to its owner's hand rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. Now, this is a similar issue to Mana Tithe. 1 doesn't sound like a lot, but you're often casting this for free. And free counter magic is ridiculously strong. You often see Daze played in 1v1 games, but this card is just an all-star in things like Canadian Highlander. But even in Commander, you could really benefit from having this card in your deck. I find myself running this in my landfall theme decks that would benefit from returning a land to hand, turning the so-called disadvantage into strict advantage for me. There are frequent scenarios where I actually would be unable to make a land drop or maybe miss out on the value of cards that would let me play extra lands, but now I unlocked that value all while countering something key that my opponents may have needed. I think that this is one of those cards that you may need to just sort of give a chance. And when your opponent's jaw hits the floor because you dazed them at the right moment, well, I think you'll begin to appreciate this card and others like it.
What, you could do more than just counter a spell?
Now, I have a video coming that actually breaks down why I think modal spells are some of the best options in Commander, and I guess you'll just have to subscribe to check that one out. But in this video, we specifically are talking about modal counter magic that makes the cut in Commander. We've already mentioned what modal means, and I'm sure you know what it is, but just as a reminder, anything modal is just something that has different options associated on the card. For instance, Mystic Confluence is a modal spell, and honestly, one of the best modal spells in blue that you can choose. It reads, choose 3. You can choose the same mode more than once. 1 is counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. Return target creature to its owner's hand, or draw a card. Now, I don't think I really need to explain why this is so good. It basically does everything that you would want to do. You can return something to hand, which not only hits your opponent, but also protects your own creatures. You can counter something, which you can choose multiple times to ensure a counter in the later stages of the game actually sticks. And if you absolutely need none of that utility, you can just pay 5 mana to draw 3 cards, which is also just fine. This card is more flexible than your high school gymnastics crush. Now, let's look at a few new additions to this category, and they're just insane. 3 steps ahead is 1 blue for an instant with Spree. Spree is a mechanic from Outlaws of Thunder Junction where you must choose at least 1 additional casting cost in order to cast the spell, but you can also add however much to kind of spree on. You can do multiple different aspects of the spree cost if you pay them. For 1 generic in a blue, you get just counter target spell. For 3 generic, create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, or 2 generic to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. This card is at home in basically every single deck that uses blue. It has very low blue requirements. It's not very hungry. It cantrips itself when you need to draw. And also, it just makes a token copy of something, which is just insanely good. We should be mindful of the copy ability in this circumstance. Typical copy effects will only hit a creature or planeswalker like a Spark Double, Arenicus's Vile Duplication, Sakashima, and the list goes on. But this copy is an artifact. Copying an artifact is actually a much bigger deal than it may seem. It makes the card a near auto-include in any single blue artifacts matter deck. It also allows you to ramp for 4 mana if you were otherwise stuck without a land drop, and it also plays well with token-themed decks like Brutoclad, for example. And this type of card, where you're adding costs to the spell as you cast it, also benefit from cost reduction. Magnus the Red, for example, loves this card, not only because it fuels his first ability with a new token, but also because if you already have plenty of tokens on the battlefield, you get to spree this card for pretty much free. This is just incredibly good, and honestly, not a dream scenario. This is another reason why I love a card like Wizards of Thay. You get to swing with the wizards, the Myriad trigger comes up, making 2 copies, and then you get to cast an instant or sorcery in combat reduced by 3. I think we're getting maybe just a bit in the weeds here, but I felt that it was important to point out a few specific interactions that take this card from good to great. Seriously, give it a try. Archmage's Charm is one of those cards that you really don't see all that often, but pretty much every time that you do, you just scratch your head and you wonder why you're not playing it. It's blue, so 3 blue pips, which gets you the effect to choose 1. Counter target spell. Target player draws 2 cards. Gain control of target non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Right off the bat, we have a better rate to draw cards. Something like a Mystic Confluence is 5 mana to draw 3, which equates out to 1.6 mana per card, where this specific circumstance is 3 mana to draw 2, which equates to 1.5 mana for each card. But this also gives you the option to counter a spell or gain control of a non-land permanent with a mana value of 1 or less. The counterspell aside, I don't want you to really undervalue the utility that this card offers to control magic something. This can take somebody's Skull Clamp or Soul Ring, Amulet of Vigor, Shadow Spear, the Ozolith, or potentially disrupt someone with a Sensei's Divining Top, forcing it to go to the top of the library for you to combo off. You can also steal tokens, especially large ones with a mana value of 0, or maybe just steal away a key enchantment like an Authority of Consoles, or a key ramp option like Burgeoning or Exploration, or maybe just hose your opponent by gaining control of a class card like a Wizard's class or Fortune Teller's Talent after they've already added on to the class level. The point here is that there is a use case for the final ability of this card that will come up all the time, and I think that you're probably underrepresenting what this card can really do in your mind. Spiritually, I feel that I should be able to group together a bunch of these modal cards, but the reality is that they have such a varied effect that it's really impossible to group them together in a rapid-fire review. I'm going to cover all of these individually, but I do want to kindly ask for your subscription to the channel if you feel you're getting some value out of the video. It just took a really long time to put this together. Let's go outside of mono blue for a moment. Drown in the Loch is only 2 mana, 1 blue and a black for the effect to counter target spell with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard, or destroy target creature with a mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. To put it short, I really like this card. Often, especially in higher powered pods, people are using fetch lands routinely. There's also often more interaction at the table in the form of counter magic and single targeted removal, all of which adds cards to the graveyard, boosting this card's effectiveness. Now, admittedly, in the early stages of the game, this card is really not that reliable. However, if you have a deck build that you can take advantage of this card by milling your opponents, for instance, I think that it's pretty much rated home in that type of commander game, and this card just absolutely slaps in pretty much every 1v1 format. Sticking with the 2-mana theme, I think that we should at least talk about Isit Charm. Isit Charm is 1 blue and a red for counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2, or Isit Charm deals 2 damage to target creature, or draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. Now, I used to use this card in pretty much every single Isit type build that I did, and I kept it in the list because I figured there would be some people asking me about it. But truthfully, I don't think it really belongs here in the recommended section, and honestly, I don't really think it belongs in the honorable mentions either. For starters, the last ability, which draws 2 and then discards 2, actually leaves you down on cards because you have to first spend the Isit Charm to then activate that effect. So going down in card advantage is never appealing, and this makes this a pretty terrible top deck in the late game if you're at that stage. Now, 2 damage to a creature sounds nice, but in reality, it's often not enough to deal with most problem commanders, and you can nitpick me all day on this if you want, but in most cases, this is the big splashy format with a lot of big butts, so you're not likely to find a high value target for the 2 damage. And finally, the counter. I would just prefer to run a negate, honestly, or any of the other modal options. The counter criteria is fine, but it's just lackluster when you can get a similar effect for only 1 blue mana with Spell Pierce, or, like I said, any of the other modal options. This card does offer you flexibility, but unfortunately, I don't really think the flexibility is worth spending 2 colored mana when you can simply have a better card slotted into your deck in place of it. Moving on, I'd like to talk about one of my absolute favorite modal spells, Confounding Riddle. This is 2 generic and a blue for the effect to look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, or counter target spell unless its controller pays 4. Now, this is really good, especially in any deck that has a graveyard theme or sort of like graveyard sub theme. Not only do you get a strong counter, it hits any spell, but it also gives you the flexibility to not only replace this card in your hand, but you also dig 4 deep in your deck, choose the best card, and you also get to fill your graveyard with useful material. This is another card that is only about 10 cents US, and the utility it offers is worth way more than that. The younger brother to this card was printed back in Hour of Devastation with Supreme Will. It's a near identical effect, except the Confounding Riddle is pretty much better on every single vector, but I thought I would really just add it here briefly so, you can sort of see the progression of cards, especially up to today. I want to save 2 of the all-time most played and arguably strongest modal counter spells for last, so let's talk about Defabricate. Defabricate is 1 generic and a blue for counter target artifact or enchantment. If a spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard, or counter target activated or triggered ability. Truthfully, the mode to counter an ability is really what drew me to this card in the first place, and it's just like a moth to a flame. It has the added benefit of countering an artifact or enchantment, by the way, to exile, which is just awesome. And there are more and more powerful abilities on commanders, so being able to effectively counter one of those abilities is really critical in our modern day game state. And if you don't believe me that there are more and more powerful abilities in Commander, and maybe I'm making too big of a deal of it, allow me to show you a screenshot of the most built commanders just this past week on EDH Rec. Pretty much every single one of these has an activated or triggered ability with serious repercussions to the other players at the table if it goes unanswered for long periods of time, especially. And moreover, you don't really need to counter a commander's ability. I was just sort of making a case for it. How about counter a key artifact ability or enchantment ability or alternative creature ability in the 99? This card can also counter a fetch land, which then can mana screw an opponent. And like I mentioned, enchantment or artifact removal is pretty good, and being able to counter the likes of a Rhystic Study, the One Ring, Smothering Tithe, or maybe even an artifact commander like the newly printed Renmaw or an old classic like Brea is also very powerful. I have to admit, the next card I have only limited experience with, and it's Spellguy. For 4 mana, you get the effect to counter target spell or surveil 2 and then draw 2 cards. Now, 4 mana is definitely overcosted for a counterspell, but the surveil 2 and then draw is actually pretty good. You get the superior type of card selection, that being surveil over scry. And you also get to then draw 2, going up by 1 on card advantage while still fueling your graveyard. And although the cost is a bit steep, this card does play nicely with my aforementioned criteria of wanting a card that isn't dead through any stage of the game. Running through the classic text of, would I be upset if I top deck this in the late game? You ask yourself that question. Further supports me that this card does have some legs, especially in more casual environments. But let's talk about the 2 cards that I've been, using more and more. And despite them being older, I'm continually blown away by how powerful they are. And those are Cryptic Command and Sublime Epiphany. Sublime Epiphany really does it all. Counter target spell, counter an ability, return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand, make a copy of a creature, and it also replaces itself by allowing somebody to draw, which even that has layers, allowing you to barter with other people at the table, giving them the draw to either dig for a better answer or maybe politic your way to get out from underneath someone else's grip. And Cryptic Command is much more limited in scope, but only costs 4 mana. Counter a spell, return any permanent to its owner's hand, tap all creatures your opponents control, or draw a card. Now, you can select all modes on Sublime Epiphany and only 2 modes on Cryptic Command, respectively. Sublime Epiphany is expensive, sitting at 6 mana, but for the amount of utility that it offers, you really don't care. And in most situations, you'll be running this in a Spellslinger style deck, which likely has cost reduction effects in place, really eliminating the 4 generic requirement, or at least part of it. Now, Cryptic Command is most closely related to Mystic Confluence with the selected modes, but it's important to note that Cryptic Command is a hard counter through and through. Also, Cryptic Command returns any permanent to hand, meaning that you could maybe target someone's problem land, Glacial Chasm. But the real bread and butter comes with tapping all of your opponent's creatures. And you read that right. It's not just one opponent, it's every single opponent. Under the right circumstances, this basically reads, win me the game, which I think pretty much all of us can get behind. No matter which one you choose, I know that you're going to be happy with your outcomes. Routinely, these cards are overperforming in almost every one of my commander decks.
Well, I guess you stopped taking things seriously a while ago, didn't you?
Now with that, we are done with the modal section and are now onto the non-counter counters, which may sound confusing, but this section is really, really important. What exactly is a non-counter counter? Simply put, it's a type of counter spell that doesn't use the word counter in the text, or it's a card that uniquely deals with a spell on the stack with a bounce to hand effect, exile effect, etc. I think that we should talk about an obvious example first to give you an idea of what I mean. Reprieve is 1 generic and a white mana for the effect to return target spell to its owner's hand, then you draw a card. Full stop, this card just bounces to hand, which also means the effect of the spell is negated for the time being. This card is a near auto include for me at least in pretty much all of my white decks because of that last piece of text to draw a card. Being able to replace a spell all the while doing something else impactful always speaks to me as a player. And this is in white, which can give you counter magic and spell protection in non-blue color combinations. Another great example of this is in white with Aven Interruptor, which reads flash and flying, by the way. When Aven Interruptor enters, exile target spell, it becomes plotted. Its owner may then cast it as a sorcery on a later turn without paying its mana cost, but Aven Interruptor says spells your opponents cast from graveyards or from exile cost 2 more to cast, which, by the way, not only hits this plotted card, but could also just be a hose against decks like Prosper Tomebound or other sort of exile into, or, play from exile style decks. And this card may not sound like a huge deal, but for 3 mana, you get a counter spell with a 2/2 flying body in non-blue. This type of effect also plays very well with welcoming vampire style effects that draw cards when a low-powered creature comes into play, being able to trigger these types of effects on your turn with sorcery speed creatures, and then play something like this on an opponent's turn with flash to get more benefit. I think that When we're building our decks with cards like this in mind, it becomes important that it fits into the deck more so than just exiling a spell. The added synergy really does go a long way. But back to blue, I'd be whipped in the streets of King's Landing while some lady is yelling,
"Shame! Shame! Shame! Shame!"
Oh, that takes me back. If I didn't mention Narset's Reversal, this card is such a staple in blue. It's not really a counter, more so a copy that has the added benefit of just blowing your opponents out. And maybe you reversal a Breach the Multiverse, or maybe an Aminatu's Augury, or how about, I don't know, a Time Stretch. It's arguable that if you reverse a spell like these, it's strictly better than just countering it in the first place. A new addition to this similar roster is Sink into Stuper, which pretty much makes it into every blue deck I build now, because you can either play it early as a land on the backside or use it later to reactively turn a spell or non-land permanent to hand. The flexibility is incredible. I don't think I really need to spend much time defending this one. It's really good, and you should probably just be playing it in pretty much all of your blue decks in place of a regular land. Of course, there are always situations where that's not the case, but in the case of Sink into Stuper, it's really quite that good. The final blue mentions are actually in the form of creatures. Venser, Shaper Savant, and Hullbreaker Horror are two majorly powerful cards that perform similar duties by returning a spell or permanent to their owner's hand. Well, I should clarify. Venser returns any permanent, and Hullbreaker Horror returns a non-land permanent. These cards are absolutely disgusting, and in many situations, game-ending. If you want to see me go into more depth about them, I have an upcoming video on modal spells like I mentioned, which you can find on my channel very soon. The final leg of this category is primarily about forks. And we can talk about the OG card, Fork, of course, but this card has largely been outclassed by better options, all of which we're going to discuss here. Forks are interesting, and honestly, I considered not putting them in here at all, but under many circumstances, these are hyper desirable cards to include in your deck, because whatever is on the stack gets copied or bounced to hand, and then you also get a copy, allowing your version of that spell to resolve first. And under plenty of circumstances, these can simply just copy a counterspell to then target the original on the stack. It's really not a foolproof plan, but if you lack blue and you're red primarily, I think these are a reasonable option to consider in your commander deck. And moreover, I would add that most of these go very well in a Spellslinger theme deck, allowing you to copy your own spells to get over the finish line. So you're seeing 6 of these on screen now: Display of Power, Dualcaster Mage, Fury Storm, Reiterate, Return the Favor, and Reverberate. Now, I don't think I need to say anything about Dualcaster Mage. It's a notorious combo piece, and I tend just to auto leave this out of my decks, but if you need a body with this copy effect, there's your guy. Reverberate was an OG inclusion, but I tend to include it less and less these days because of some of the others shown on screen now. For example, in decks where I need a mana sink or have lots of excessive mana, Reiterate shines, allowing me to buy back over and over again for crazy value. Or in the case of Return the Favor, this little uncommon lets you copy a spell, redirect a spell, or just do both, which is really quite amazing for just a few red mana. The flexibility is really quite nice. And Display of Power is a unique one, copying any number of instants or sorceries, which can either be the biggest blowout of your opponent's careers or just an overcosted copy effect. I tend to use this only in a storm-heavy build, but I do like the flavor of the card nonetheless, and, Lord of the Rings was a good set. And then finally is Fury Storm. This card shines in any partner commander deck, allowing you to get multiple instances of the cast your commander this game clause to then get bonus value copying a specific spell. I don't really run this in all my decks, but in partner commanders specifically, I think that this really does have a home, and it should be considered in most decks that contain red. Definitely give this one a look. I can't really believe I'm saying this because the video has been going on so long, kind of losing my voice right now, and the video I think has been full of just great counter magic options and useful information, but we've actually reached the very final section. These are the broken, absolutely disgusting counter spells that probably many of us know.
This is the part where you pick up all your cards and you leave the table.
All right. Look, there's no two ways about it. In a majority of circumstances, the cards that we mention here are format staples of CDH, powerhouses in 1v1, and will eternally be hyper abusable and strong. I'm not going to spend a long time talking about each one because if you're looking for this type of power, well, you likely already have been playing for a while and you don't need any direction on how or when to include these. If you're a newer player, I would highly encourage you to just take one moment before proceeding and consider what type of play experience you want with your friends. These counters are absolutely rage-inducing unless you have a specific group who knows full well this is the type of experience you want. That being extremely high-powered and or CEDH level events where you have a complex stack and free counter magic is the standard. I cannot recommend playing these cards in a casual setting because, well, simply put, they're not casual. If you play Force of Will against a precon, I think that you likely have some unresolved issues. So I think it's best that we just put all these cards on screen right now, and I'll give a little blurb about each one to satisfy the sycophants. Mana Drain. In a world where mana burn existed, this card would have been balanced. Now, it's just one of the most cracked counter spells in the entire game. Deflecting Swat. If you wondered why this didn't show up in the non-counter section, this is why. It's disgusting. Fierce Guardianship. Yep. Force of Will. Yep. Force of Negation. Mind Break Trap. Oh yeah. Pact of Negation. This is engaging commentary. Subscribe to my channel. Flusterstorm. These are really the cream of the crop. High-powered, free or nearly free. And I could be missing one or two inclusions here, but largely when I think of high-powered magic, these are the spells that come to mind. Now, I do have some honorable mentions. These cards aren't bad, just maybe not strong enough to make it into my top recommendations. So let's go down the list. Red and also blue Elemental Blast. It's a bit too narrow on what they can hit for the average commander game, and they can lead to an unnecessary type of hosing for certain players at the table. And for the same exact reason, Pyro and Hydroblast were left out of this list. Guttural Response, it's just a bit too narrow. I've tried it, but it doesn't hit enough to make it a reliable inclusion in your Gruul deck. Spell Snare, again, just a bit too narrow for Commander. 2 CMC is a really good slot to counter, and it's very aggressively costed, but this card has really been relegated to 1v1 games for me because it's just a bit too narrow and doesn't service me in the later stages of the game. Mental Misstep and Minor Misstep. Now, these are cards that improve with the quality of the high-powered pod that you're in. For me, the average commander game doesn't quite have enough impactful one-drops aside from Soul Ring or other types of fast mana that I actually don't really play against anyway, so I don't really include these. Strict Serenade. I love the idea here, but Swan Song just massively outclasses this card in pretty much every single category that can be countered. Therefore, I don't play it, and I tend to find it's really not that good of a counter. Plasm Capture, Mana Drain at home. It's fine, but you always feel bad getting this card countered after investing 4 colored pips of mana, and for that same reason, it's a little bit overcosted. An offer you can't refuse. You'd think I would put this card in the hard counter section. It's 1 mana for this effect, which is good, and don't get me wrong, it is good, but unfortunately, I've been burned a bit too many times by the extra treasure that my opponents get after the counter resolves. In high-powered pods, it maybe makes a bit more sense, but I really do like to die as much advantage for my opponents as I can, and I just think that some of the other options we discussed are better for those reasons. Trick Bind, it really is good, but it's really overcosted for this type of effect. And by overcosted, I mean financially overcosted. This card has not been reprinted in a long time, and I just really think it's not worth the price tag. Withering Boon, it's funny, sure, and it definitely turns heads. I included this in one of my videos about black cards, but it's a bit too narrow to make the list of cards that could replace a counterspell. Not of This World, I actually really like this card, even though it's pretty terrible. The only format that I can really reliably see this used in is Commander, due to you having access to a creature more or less at all times that has 7 or greater power. I used to play this in my Toxrill deck, and it worked really well there, but every other time you don't have a creature out, or maybe you're trying to resolve a creature and it's just getting countered on the stack, you're just shit out of luck. Sadly, it's really not that great. And then lastly is Invert Polarity. I honestly just forgot this existed. It is really good. It probably should have gone into the hard counter section, so spare me and don't roast me on the spike. And that's it. I really hope that you enjoyed this sort of massive compendium on counterspells, and I hope you learned something or found some new favorite counters nestled inside. If I missed one of your favorite counterspells, which is certainly a possibility, make sure that you rage message me in the comments down below and tell me how terrible I am. This video did take a super long time to put together, not just for my years of playtesting, but also scripting and compiling data and the post-production side of editing. If you got something out of this, share it with a friend, and be sure to also check out my new gameplay series, Commander Showdown, or 1 for 1, which are both going to be on the channel shortly. I hope to see you back for another video. Don't forget to love each other, and I'll see you very soon for the next video. Bye, guys. Yeah, by the way, it's Dr. Pepper, 0 sugar, strawberries, and cream edition. Actually pretty good, and I'll fight you on it.
More people aren't people.